Hello, I'm Cara Macri. I'm the Director of Preservation Services at Historic Albany Foundation, and the Van Ostrande Radliff House and the management of the building, all of the different projects that we're doing, its tours is kind of something that falls under my purview. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit about the history of the building, its architecture, and kind of explore the building virtually a little bit, so all of you can get a bit of an idea of the space and the character of our lovely 1728 house. So this is a picture of the Van Ostrande Radliff house as it is now. The house was constructed in 1728 when Albany was still culturally Dutch. Dutch rule in Albany and New York ended around 1686. And they still built in the Dutch style quite a bit. It was really another almost 50 years later that they were still building in the same traditions. So you would see a lot of buildings in the city of Albany that looked very similar to what you would find in the Netherlands. So here's an image of what it looked like then, and this image has kind of been extrapolated from physical evidence in the building. In a little bit, we'll get into how the building changed over time. But all of the information that we needed to tell us how it looked when it was constructed in 1728 actually remains in one piece of wood and educated this entire image, which is really kind of interesting. So we'll get into all of those nitty-gritty details. You can see the map to the left shows Albany. It's a rendering of it around 1695. You can see we've marked 48 Hudson with a little star. This city at the time was a fortified city. It still had its protective stockade built around it. And as you can see, 48 Hudson and the Van Ostrande Radliff House is just outside the stockade, which actually is quite interesting because it really begins to fill in these gaps for us with what was happening in Albany during this kind of intermediate period. We know a good bit about what was going on under Dutch rule prior to 1686, and then around 1800 we see a lot more, whether it's maps or even almost like renderings. There were several artists that did kind of depictions of what Albany looked like around 1800 to give us an idea of what it was like. But we have this period in the middle that we don't know very much about. And so this house really begins to fill in some of those gaps for us. So we know it was constructed in 1728 outside the stockade. The gentleman who built the building, Johannes van Ostrande, was an alderman for the 3rd Ward when he moved to his home here. And so if he's already an alderman, that tells us that there was a neighborhood around here. Things were happening outside the stockade and the city was growing. So the more research that we do on this house, the more we're finding that there really is this neighborhood growing and growing to the south of the city, which is really quite interesting. As you can see here, I mentioned it was built kind of in the Dutch style, very similar to what you'd see in the Netherlands. This is a rendering of New Amsterdam when it was initially settled, I guess, in 1624. And you can see that very urban style building, the gable facing the street, narrow side to the street, very deep down the lot. You saw these buildings predominantly really in Manhattan or New Amsterdam. You saw them in Albany and you saw them in Schenectady. Everywhere else, really in New Netherland, they were more of the farmhouse style, the entries on the side. And for all the Netherlands, I don't need to explain to you what that looks like because you can just look outside. So for the Americans that see it, it's more of the what you'd find at historic Huguenot Street. So a little bit different style. The buildings that are predominantly left here now from this time period are not urban. There are very, very few left from this style. Manhattan's, what you can see here, all of that was pretty much demolished for Wall Street and the business district and Battery Park at the southern tip of Manhattan. Albany, here's a little rendering by one of our local artists, Len Tantillo, who does amazingly accurate renderings of historic sites, and this period is of particular interest to him. And you can see how similarly the buildings in his rendering kind of match up with what the Van Ostrande Radliff house looks like. This is Fort Orange, which was the initial settlement for Albany, and all of the buildings that would have been within this area are gone. Fort Orange was kind of a stone's throw from where the Van Ostrande Radliff house is, and outside kind of the fortified part of the city on that map that I showed earlier. So that area is completely gone. In Albany, there are two buildings of similar style. We have the Van Ostrande Radliff house, so you can see that kind of to the right. And then we have Quackenbush House, which begins to depart from that style and become a little bit more anglicized. Here are a couple similar buildings in Schenectady. You can see, again, very similar, that urban style with the gable facing the street. Interestingly enough, though, most of what we have left here in the United States are brick buildings. Whether they're brick fronted, as you can see, the two kind of on the top have a brick front. They're timber framed on the sides. And then the bottom one is completely timber framed, which is actually still there, even though this photo dates back to, I think it's like the 1980s, maybe a little bit earlier. But yeah, so we have very few timber-framed urban-style buildings left. And the Van Ostrande Radliff house is really interesting because it actually kind of combines this timber framing with the brick front, and it has kind of a half brick front on it, with the top being either shingle-clad or almost like a not quite board and batten type appearance with weatherboards. There's very few of these that have even been documented left in the United States. Here's a view of a couple buildings from Albany where you can see how this is kind of an Albany thing, really. The building to the top on the left is the Winnie Krebel House, which is actually in Bethlehem, and that's actually undergone a bit of restoration work. And as you can see, it's very, very similar to the Van Ostrande Radliff house, and we're actually built kind of around contemporary times. So yeah, this kind of style with the timber frame, partial brick front really seems to have been very, very popular in Albany. And this is the only building left that actually depicts that particular architectural kind of subtype, really. Okay, so now that we've looked a little bit about kind of the general contextual architecture for the area and New Netherland, I want to look a little bit more about how the Van Ostrande Radliff house grew. As you could see from the beginning slide, it doesn't quite look like that anymore. We have the image on the front of the building, but the front is really kind of a plywood wall. The building is almost totally encapsulated within another building, and we'll get to a photo of what that looks like today shortly. But the building grew quite a bit. I mean, as buildings do, they change with their owners and users' needs. And this house grew and changed almost every 50 years. It seems like it was getting another facelift, whether it was getting wider, taller, additions. It's kind of a little house that just kept on growing and growing and growing. So on the left, you can see the rendering we've been using with what it looked like in 1728. We've actually recently just found that actually as potentially as late as the 1840s, the building had its first really major modification where it was actually widened. You can see the 1728 image. It's very, very narrow. And it actually grew a little bit to include almost like a carriage pass-through on the east side, allowing wagons, carts, whatnot to reach the back, where there was clearly an industrial use. By the late 1830s, early 1840s, it's been noted that this building was no longer just a residence, but that there was also Jared Holt's leather good business there. So there was obviously something they needed to get back there too, whether it was a workshop. But the fact that they needed this kind of pass-through also tells us that this block was very developed. So how do you access the back of your property, which was whether it was a workshop or the business or whatnot? You needed to be able to access that. So they had to create their own little kind of avenue back that was then later protected. When they widened it, they also made a full second story. As you can see here, it's really just a 1.5 story house when it was constructed. And then later on, it was made to be a full 2 stories. And interestingly enough, instead of just taking the roof off, which is something that you would kind of see in the United States, when we modify buildings, we take things apart and we just put new stuff on. But interestingly enough here, they actually cut the collar ties and splayed the roof out, kind of flattening it a bit, and then raised it up 4 feet to give them a full second story, and then this kind of third story garret. So it drastically increased the space that they had, presumably so you could have a bigger business on the first floor, and there was still residential noted upstairs. So Jared Holt, who had the business on the first floor and in the back, still lived there with his family. So it gave them more living space, with his shop now being on the ground floor of the building. By actually right around, I think it was 1892, the house went through another major change with another major addition. George Stoneman had purchased the building and was using it for his knit necktie and knit underwear manufacturing. And the house itself was not really quite suited for that kind of industrial manufacturing. And so there was a large addition that had been built. We're kind of working on a date right now. It's looking around the mid 1860s, possibly as late as 1870, where this big brick addition that you can just kind of see peeking out behind the photo where it has George T. Stoneman on it. If you look just past the gable, you can see this brick addition popping up on the back, and you can see how close the neighboring buildings are too in that point. See how dense this neighborhood really had become by then. This photo dates to around 1926, the mid-1920s, but the building had looked like this for quite some time before then. As you can see in both photos, it had lost its residential appearance on the front and really kind of adopted the very stereotypical mixed-use commercial storefront that you see very prevalent here in Albany, and I'm sure you see a lot in the Netherlands as well within cities. Here's a kind of zoomed out image of the entire really neighborhood that surrounds the Van Ostrande Radliff house. So you can see how really densely populated it was. This photo was taken, I want to say, after 1914. It's from the Dean H building, which many Albany people will know is kind of the big, almost castle-like building that was constructed along the Hudson and has these large towers, and so you could finally look out and get this almost bird's-eye view of the neighborhood from the tower of the Dean H building and the Albany Evening Journal, which I think is the tower all the way to the south. So yeah, so you can see the Van Ostrande Radliff house is kind of highlighted in orange. So it's a very dense neighborhood. You can also see that addition that you could see in the back of the 1926 photo is there, but it's also shorter. So again, the house that kept on growing, it had a large brick addition put on that then by the 1920s was already bigger. That was the addition that we believe was put on around 1892. It was made a little bit, that could have been because if it was 1914. So that addition was added a little bit later. Or made taller a little bit later, and then more and more kept growing and growing. Here's what the building looked like by the late 1930s. This image dates to 1938, the one in the middle, and you can see they had put this kind of false front on the building, and most of the historic or the original facade had kind of been removed by that point. You could tell the little opening on the top sort of kind of references what used to be there, and probably the opening for that, I'm sure, was somewhere smaller within the opening that you see. The door placement has obviously moved. The storefront is very different. The whole second floor now has this large ribbon window. So this was kind of the big main departure from what it had looked like, kind of telling the story a little bit of its early heritage. By the 1970s, actually really almost as early as the 50s and 60s, the building next door had been demolished. So as soon as this neighborhood kind of hit critical mass, was fully developed, the buildings then started departing again, looking for more parking space. And we found there was actually an urban renewal project. I don't know if you have these in the Netherlands, but they have plagued the United States since the mid to late 20th century, where we were kind of demolishing whole swaths of neighborhoods to improve and renew our neighborhoods. And so they had planned to build all these big new kind of mega structures, whether it was housing complexes or convention centers. So there was this kind of urban renewal project planned for the area around the Van Ostrande Radliff house as early as 1956, 57. And so a lot of the buildings began to be demolished around it. So you can see how they started kind of disappearing around it in the 1979 photo. You can also see it kind of re-exposed that gable a little bit, which started to really get historians kind of thinking about it a little bit more since it had been hidden for so long. no one really knew it was hiding back there, and that gable kind of helped fill in that question, or begin to answer that question of what really is there and how old is it. Here's an image of what it looks like pretty much today. You can see all of the later additions that were put on. So what started as this kind of very small, intimate, but by no means lower class home, it is certainly now a bit more of a sprawling industrial behemoth. We'll talk a little bit more during the program about Historic Albany's aspirations for this, but the quick Cliff Notes version is that we do plan to restore the house portion itself, which is kind of that front third on the exterior, to appear as it did in 1728, and then kind of conserve the interior and the other additions so that they can be reused as an active part of what will be a new neighborhood in downtown Albany. There's a rendering of what we hope it'll look like in a few years. We have a tight time frame, but I think we'll hopefully meet that schedule. All right, and we're going to shift real quick to have a look at the inside of the building, which is definitely quite fun, really. Let me get this blown up. Unfortunately, with the software they have, they don't really have a view of the exterior, so it's tough to kind of orient where you are. This crazy exploded view is the interior of the Van Ostrande Radliff house. And as we're talking about adaptive reuse, I think it makes sense to kind of explore the inside of the building now that we've looked at how the building has grown and some of the changes it underwent and a few of the different uses. Maybe it helps to kind of just explore the interior to see really what's going on inside. If anyone wants to really do some extra homework, this is on our website, and you can actually manipulate it yourself and walk through and wander through the building, and all of the little colorful dots are bits of information. Some of them have photographs, some of them have voiceover recordings, and all kinds of fun information if anyone wants to wander through at their own pace. So this is, we're standing within the house itself. You can see the anchor beams, the heavy timber framing from within the house. So this would be the front wall right here, right up against the street. This is a bit old, so unfortunately you can't see the beautiful new posts for the H-bents that are right where the silver post is. It's just over there. We have to update this now that we've done so much restoration work on the interior, stabilization rather. We just finished restoring the H-bents and giving ourselves a new foundation, which is pretty important. So it's pretty open on the interior. As you can see, there's not a whole lot of finishes left. However, that being said, this was certainly not a fancy building. There was not gold leaf and huge crown moldings and big pocket doors that you would expect in some of our bigger Victorian homes. But the interior is, you actually kind of see what you got a little bit. There would have been 2 rooms, one in the front, one in the back. The H-bents would have been exposed, unfinished, just as they are. So that middle partition has been removed, and is probably the biggest change, and the removal of the staircase that would have been toward the middle on the east wall. So what we're looking at right here is the side jambless fireplace, which was one of the key features that was brought over from the Netherlands when they brought their architectural traditions here. That is kind of one of the other big losses, as we did lose the chimney here, which is unfortunate, but we hope to recreate portions of that. You can see how the hood, kind of in this little diagram over here, how that kind of went. But yeah, we're hoping to recreate a portion of that so you can see again what it looked like. This would have been kind of the inside of the flue. We have the fire back still, and a lot of those kind of technical nitty-gritty details. It's really the bones of the building that you see, and I think that's what we find the most interesting about this building, is that the architecture and the bones of the building, which are usually kind of hidden by finishes and furniture when you restore a building, so it looks like, the family just stepped out to the market, and it has all the trappings of being lived in. You don't necessarily notice the architecture, but I think one of the things we want to focus on is really the authenticity of the materials that we have. it really is all still here. Behind this plywood, and you can see bits of it kind of in the middle, we have the brick nogging that went between each set of posts for the H-vents, and that would have just been the interior wall. So all of that stays. And then we have, this is the industrial space. So where this kind of central column is, this begins that large 3-story brick industrial addition that you see, which even looking at the columns is still pretty early on to the mid 19th century. So still has its own architectural merit. So this interior will really be conserved, and a lot of the extraneous framing that you see, all of that awful light dimensional lumber, that all is going to go. So it gives us a nice big space. And from an adaptive reuse standpoint, it really kind of leaves us with a blank canvas. What can you do with this wide open space? We don't need to make it another honeycomb of spaces, or do you want to make it more intimate spaces depending on what the use is? But I think it gives us a lot more opportunity and possibility as we look at reusing this very, very historic structure. I'm just going to zip to the back real quick since we're already on the first floor. As you can see, there's several additions. And as we kind of go through the big tall addition, we get to the back here, which this was actually even added on in the 20th century. And you really couldn't see that from many of the photos because they're all from the front. But you can see we have this big 1-story addition that was also put on. And all of this really tells the story of how the building changed. The house looks very clearly like it could be a house. The industrial addition looks very clearly like it's an industrial building. And this addition reflects a bit more of the commercial use. There's a loading dock on the inside. They parked trucks back here for the trucking business that was here in the 20s. It still meets that kind of commercial and industrial, and you can really see that reflected in the architecture. Also, big open space with high ceilings that you can do all kinds of different things with. As you can see at the moment, we're storing architectural salvage there because that's one of the other tenets of what Historic Albany does, is we have an architectural salvage shop, and when we just get too many things in our parts warehouse, sometimes other things tend to migrate to the Van Ostrand Radliff house for a little while. So we're going to run upstairs to take a look at what some of the upstairs spaces look like. I think I'm already way over my time, but we'll be quick. Hopefully this isn't making anyone motion sick, the way we move through this. Oh my. Okay, so this is still the inside of the house. And again, it's not exactly as you see it today. This big opening that you see in there has actually since been filled in with, oh my goodness, matching flooring. It's very exciting. And some of this dimensional lumber has since been removed. As we restore the exterior of the house, or more the shape of the house, to how it was in 1728, a portion of what you see here will actually, and very unfortunately, be lost. We're going to be removing this wall, which was actually put on, we believe, sometime in the 1940s. And so there'll actually be another interior wall a bit closer, almost like where that green dot is. Will kind of be the terminus of the building. However, as I said, we have an architectural salvage shop, and we're always encouraging people to reuse architectural parts. We're looking to use as much of the building parts as we can. So if we're building new partitions, or we need cladding or flooring, anything removed from the building will ideally be reused in the building. So we're actually not buying very much, and we're certainly not sending anything to the landfill. We're reusing everything. Sustainability is also a big thing to us. So again, you can see how this is a very wide open space without the extra structural framing. All that shoring will be removed, leaving a very big open space for as much as it can. But one of the things to remember is that as we lower the roof back down, because that is indeed an important part of restoring the exterior appearance, the roof will actually be narrowed back in and brought back down to where it was initially. So this ceiling that you see here will actually go, and it'll be opened up so you can see the roof. So this will be kind of a 1.5 story, so it'll be that half-story space again. So it'll actually be a little bit more of an intimate space. We kind of see the second floor, not quite a garret, of the house as a sort of separate programmatic space than the brick addition, because the brick addition has a much higher ceiling. It's much more open. The light's very different, and they had very different uses. So I think it gives us the possibility to use these spaces a little bit differently, and we're kind of thinking about them a little bit differently too. One thing that we just wanted to point out as we're looking at reusing this building, we don't want to take interpretation off the table by any means. Obviously, as I said, we want to look a lot more at the authenticity of the materials and the building and kind of tell that early story in Albany. We have several great historic house museums in Albany, and we really felt that the most engaging way to really expose the public to this heritage was not necessarily to make it another museum. Museums here really are struggling to get people to return. They come once, they come twice, and they don't quite continue to engage people. So we really want to look at uses that will continue to bring people in. There's always something new for them to look at, another reason they want to come down and check out the Van Ostrande and Radliff house. And it's kind of education by osmosis, if you will. So now we're in the addition, the large 3-story addition. So you can see it's a big space, and it really does differ in just its kind of quality and the characteristics. It's a very different space from what the second story of the house is. So we're kind of looking at that a little bit differently. Obviously, it'll be treated a little bit differently. And one of the conversations that we've been having with our architects is, do we put a divider of some sort to kind of mark the rear wall of the Van Ostrande Radliff house from the addition to give it that space separation so you can be doing two things at the same time. But at the same time, we really want to preserve this view, which I don't know how dreadfully well you can see it here. It's so much better in person. You'll all just have to come visit us in Albany as soon as you're feeling to traveling, whether it's international or domestic. The view is to really look up into the roof. I guess we'll have to look up from here. The view looking up into that roof is really quite breathtaking in person, and as we're lowering it, we're going to be bringing it much closer to all of you and anyone else visiting the building. So we really want to preserve that view into the garret, because the structural system up there and the fact that this really is the original roof from 1728 is really quite something to behold. So that we're going to keep kind of as is, really, and want to keep that within how we're using the space. We'll hop up here for a moment and see if I can get up into the garret. Yes! So yeah, this is kind of the third-story garret that was created as the house changed. That floor, again, will be removed as the roof comes down. So this little space will actually kind of cease to exist and merge with the space below, creating one very intimate space. Behind it, however, is another story to the big brick addition. It just keeps growing and growing. And so this is yet another space that can be used and interpreted differently and treated a little bit differently. So we're kind of seeing the house as one, whether it's one use or one mode of treatment. The big brick addition is kind of another, whether it's another use or another type of treatment, and then the rear addition kind of the same. We're sort of lumping the additions together a little bit, and we see kind of the first floor, it kind of connects everything, right? So it's one big open space where you can explore everything. So there's different ways to divide it up, and that's something that we can talk about a little bit more in Tuesday's workshop. But yeah, so here's really the architecture of the inside to give you all an idea of spatially what's going on, what the building looks like, what its current condition is. Oh, and a lovely view of the parking lots behind the building, because who doesn't want a parking lot as a neighbor? Hopefully there'll be buildings there in the hopefully not too dreadfully distant future. Okay, so what are we using the building as right now? And I'll quickly end with that since I've gone way over the time allotted. Right now, the building is vacant, as you can see. There's really nothing in there. However, we're constantly bringing people in. We do tours the first Friday of every month, and it always brings a new range of people, whether they're families with their children, whether it's the older generation, whether it's someone who's just walking by on their way out of work or to somewhere else, and they poke their head in because the door is wide open and they just want to check it out. There are always people coming in for our tours to kind of just explore this little but not so little building that exists on its own in the sea of parking lots, but looks kind of cool from the front. And then we're beginning to have more kind of festival events and different things. We have it's not quite a craft fair, we're calling it a winter festival, in December, and no one has any issues about braving the cold to come out and hang out in our very, very frosty vacant building. And we've been having local artisans sell their wares at our winter events, whether it's books, it's things beautifully carved out of wood, mittens, and oh my goodness, architectural salvage. It comes up everywhere. So we've been doing a lot of different things, and we're hoping to bring that into some of the reuses that we've been looking at for the building. So future reuse, definitely conversations for later on in the week, and I hope everyone will be able to tune in and see all of our presentations on Thursday, so they can find out all the fun, funky things we've been talking about this week about how we're going to reuse this really unique site. And so for that, I'll just leave you with a photo of the front, and thank you for bearing with me with my very long-winded talk, and I think that's it for now. Thank you for joining me.